This is Charlotte Talks. I'm Mike Collins. Outside of a rising homicide rate that is still lower than when they once dubbed Charlotte Little Chicago, we don't think of ourselves as being a fertile ground for crime. Certainly the Chamber of Commerce would discourage that idea, but we have had our share of crime and therefore crime stories in our past. Some rank up there with the worst of them and made national headlines. Others were confined to the local news and are now mostly forgotten. Until our guest this hour dug them up. And I guess the first question I'll ask of Kathy Pickens is why a person who has been a college professor, a provost, even a Southern mystery writer, would want to dive into our criminal past and dredge up all of our dirty laundry. But she has, so she's here because she's put them all in a book, Charlotte's True Crime Stories, Notorious Cases from Fraud to Serial Killing. And we'll welcome you to the program with some trepidation.
Well, thank you,
Good morning.
Mike. I appreciate it. You make a reference to an article that was in the Observer back in 1940 where the editor took issue with the fact that J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI had left Charlotte out of their crime statistics. And I love the studied outrage that he has in his editorial, because he says the man, speaking of J. Edgar Hoover, not only has no feeling for the proper pride of a city, he has no sense of drama either. So I think that's probably what.
Well, to put that in historical context, as you said, that happened in 1940. I think it was a tongue-in-cheek article or editorial in the Charlotte News, the afternoon paper here at the time. They had been snubbed by J. Edgar Hoover because we weren't on this list. We
would have been the top of the list.
Yes, we would have beat out Atlanta as
and Chicago.
But a year, I think the annual FBI crime statistics reported nothing about Charlotte that year, even though a year earlier, in 1939, we led the nation in murders based on population.
Mm-hmm. Per 100,000 is how they measure, yeah.
Well, now there's a dubious distinction.
Yeah.
Were there studies conducted, like the 10-year study that we conduct now to find out why?
Well, and we never do figure out why, do we? We have all these things that we list, but it doesn't really explain it,
So why? I said I would, in the very beginning, I would ask you why you felt compelled.
Well, these are stories that help shape who Charlotte is. I'm not from Charlotte. I moved in here 35 years ago. My dad was from the hill country in South Carolina, near Clemson. And my dad from Western North Carolina was a little
How's your mom or them?
They're fine, thank you.
I'm sorry.
And my dad was worried because what he knew about Charlotte was PTL, the motorcycle gangs, and professional wrestling. Okay, so that was my introduction to Charlotte. I said, well, there's a lot more here. But as I lived and worked here, I was at Queens for those years. I realized that these crime stories really are a part of the fabric of the city, and they have helped shape what we may see in the city now and don't realize that that's where it came from. That a case caused us to have the Citizens Police Review Board, or that a case helped, that's why the tennis center is named after somebody. That we don't realize that there's these marks that we pass every day.
Yeah.
And I think it also, with looking at the unique stories about Charlotte, reminds us, and I think also with a good sense of humor.
People should know that you have a series of mystery novels and a character that you created to headline those mystery novels, because you grew up, you say, on Perry Mason.
I did. That was continuing legal ed.
And Nancy Drew.
Yes.
Do people still read the Nancy Drew novels?
I keep shoving them on every little girl I can find, but I don't know.
Because I grew up on Nancy Drew because my mother had all of them, and my grandmother used to read them to me before I could read, and then I began to read them all. So, and she was very adventuresome for her time. She was in the 1920s, and she had a roadster and adventures and all that good stuff. Why did you turn from fiction to nonfiction?
The truth of the matter is I went to jail. I quit at Queens after a wonderful career there and started volunteering at the Mecklenburg County Jail. and started teaching guys first how to start their own businesses and then create writing class because he asked for it. And when one, who's now since become a very good friend of mine, said, "Who's Agatha Christie?" knifed my heart. I realized that fictional stories, while fun, puzzles, have a counterpart in real life. And that's when these stories began. I'd always researched them and read them to provide the basis for the novels. I wanted to get the facts right. But then I realized the power of the stories themselves and the people involved.
And they're mystery stories.
They are.
For a period of time until they're solved.
And those are the ones that intrigue us. I think it's the puzzle solving that both in crime fact and crime fiction draws us in. We like to make sense of things that don't make sense.
You mentioned Agatha Christie, and mysteries and things like that have been with us for a long time and really popular, but so have true crime stories. Back in the, I think, 20s, 30s, 40s, there were, I don't know what they were called, but they were paperbacks, or they're almost like comic books. They were cheap paper, printed on cheap paper, true crime detective stories.
But the magazines,
And then, of course, recently we had the Serial podcast, which has taken the nation by storm. It's been downloaded, I think, 340 million times. And there have been spin-offs of that, of other podcasts, and there have been an HBO documentary based on it called The Case Against Adnan Syed. What do you think the public's fascination with true crime stories is?
I think we've always been fascinated with those stories and why they happen. I think there's various reasons. I think, number one, the puzzle solving. We like to make sense out of life. Why did this happen? I think there's another layer there, and that is we want to know how we can protect ourselves. If you look at the demographics for true crime and mystery fiction, predominantly women. And we want to know, can we recognize the guy that's bad? Can we protect ourselves or our children or the people that we love? Can we not only solve that puzzle, in the book, but can we solve it in real life, maybe prevent it from happening? And then I think there's one last layer that we don't talk about a lot, and there's always that little question, am I capable of that myself?
When you said that when you write mystery novels, you try to do a lot of research to make sure you get the facts right and get the. I guess when you're talking, I talked to Kathy Reichs many times on this program, and she was a forensic anthropologist who spun off into the Kathy Reichs novel, the Tempe Brennan novels, and into the Bones television series. And she tries to get the facts right, the scientific facts. This could happen because this is because of the science. So when you write a mystery novel, and you just said people want to know if they can protect themselves, if they can be safe. Does the same thing go into the mystery novels as goes into the writing about these true crime stories?
I think so. There's a lot of research in neuroscience recently about why we read story. I mean, why since caveman times have we been telling each other stories for our whole existence? If this weren't important to us, we would have progressed past it. We would have, wiped it away in evolution somewhere. But we need story. And it's a testing ground, according to latest research, to try out life for ourselves, both fiction and nonfiction. We feel the emotion, we sense the danger, we solve the puzzle, we forecast what might happen. And I think that's a really critical part, whether we're listening to a podcast, we're watching Investigation Discovery Network, or we're Dateline, or reading a book, or one of those salaciously juicy true crime magazines from years past.
I don't want to throw cold water on all this, but I'm going to because it's my job. Because according to one psychology professor, consuming too many of these true crime stories through podcasts and documentaries and TV serials and dramas and books can increase feelings of paranoia and inhibit people from taking risks, even minor risks. Were you aware of that? Did you think about that when you compiled all these stories in this book?
I think that he's talking about an obsessive amount there, because we always have listened to and read. We pick up the newspaper and see what's going on in our neighborhood. you can get an overload with that. And if we're replaying the same thing over and over again.
Yeah.
And you also have to check your sources, which we won't have a lecture today on critical thinking skills, but what's the truth in the stories that are being told? But if we boil a story, and this is what I try to do in this book, I don't like gore. I don't want to live in some truly evil person's head because I can't possibly understand that. I want to tell the stories as people have experienced them, but at a safe remove. None of these cases are completely contemporary. The most recent one is the Mark Carver and Erie Yarmolenko case. But I want a little distance. I want it to be boiled down so we can step back and see it in a historical context and absorb it as at a safe remove, not in an immersive sort of wallowing in it.
Except to write this, I'm sure that you were exposed to all of that and just chose to write around it or find other ways to write it so that we don't get ourselves bogged down in the blood, so to speak.
Or the boring details that happen in court.
Does it have that effect on you? I mean, when you're exposed to this, either researching for mystery novels or actually writing about these true crime stories that happened here in Charlotte, did that have an effect on you? Does it make you scared to go out at night?
No, interestingly, no. And well, the guys asked me when they got to know me in jail, you weren't ever scared?
Yeah.
No, I wasn't. It's not a foolhardiness because I am the person scanning the parking lot, but that's just a normal, natural reaction. Like I say, though, I think women have to be more careful, and I think that's why we tend to read
being
things.
Aware and being alert are smart things
Absolutely.
to be, period.
Absolutely.
No matter who you are.
I'm the one you want around if
You
something's
can be a
going
linebacker
down.
and you should be alert. Charlotte is experiencing right now a high homicide rate. We have surpassed last year's total in terms of the homicide count.
Heartbreaking.
But we have yet to reach our all-time
That's
high.
true.
Early on in this book, you write about murders here. You write, quote, in 1977, the police compiled Charlotte's crime data to create an average murderer, a man who uses a pistol and kills somebody he knows during an argument at a residence between 10 and 11 on Saturday. That description, you say, summarizes with fair accuracy more recent crime statistics. So while it may seem like things change, they really don't. That's from your book.
Isn't that sad?
The statistics aren't what fascinate people.
No.
It's the stories behind the crime.
Absolutely.
Do the stories change, or are they the same?
Well, one of my favorite stories is Razor Girl.
Yes, we're going to talk about that.
Okay.
Don't get into that now.
Don't talk about Razor
because we don't have time.
We do have these stories. It's kind of dull. I'm sorry. It's still tragic and heartbreaking when somebody just has an argument and they shoot somebody and lives are changed horribly as a result of that. But those aren't the mysteries that fascinate us. Right. Those aren't the mysteries that we try to unpick and try to understand because we understand just getting angry and doing something stupid.
And Razor Girl is one of them. I don't want you to talk about it yet because we'll have 30 seconds left, and it's going to take more than 30 seconds.
She's too good, isn't she?
She's too good. It was one of my favorite stories in the book.
Yes, I'm glad.
Which speaks volumes about me, I think, not about you. When we come back, we're going to talk more about how the South fits in with crime and gruesome crime, and then we will bring you the aforementioned Razor Girl story, which I knew nothing about. And it happened right around the corner from where I used to work before I came here. Kathy Pickens is our guest. She's the author of Charlotte's True Crime Stories, Notorious Cases from Fraud to Serial Killing, and we are coming right back at Charlotte Talks on WFAE. Support for Charlotte Talks comes from WFAE members and Tyndall Subaru Gastonia, featuring the new Outback with eyesight safety technology that sees problems and initiates action to help avoid trouble. Details at TyndallSubaru.com and on Facebook at Tyndall Subaru. And the Foundation Fighting Blindness Charlotte Vision Seminar, featuring scientific advancements, clinical trials, and more, September 14th. More at givefightingblindness.org/Charlotte Vision Seminar. Well, tomorrow on this program at 9, how our political system is killing our democracy. Our politics is essentially a duopoly, two political parties that set the rules by which politics here operates, and they battle savagely for power, but they collude to polarize us. We're going to find out about how that duopoly avoids compromise and has ceased to work and is, in one person's mind, destroying the country. That's tomorrow on this program at 9.
What will the fast pace of technological change mean for your life? BP's former CEO John Brown says it's not all bad news. Engineers give him reason to see the glass as half full. I'm Joshua Johnson. John Brown on how engineering impacted our past and will shape our future. Next time on 1A from WAMU and NPR.
That conversation coming up in the 11 o'clock hour of 1A here on 90.7 WFAE, Charlotte's NPR news source.
It's Charlotte Talks on listener-funded 90.7 WFAE and 90.3 WFHE. I'm Mike Collins, and we're talking about Charlotte's true crime stories. A lot of crime over the course of time here in Charlotte, and Kathy Pickens has taken it upon herself to chronicle all of this in her new book, Charlotte's True Crime Stories, Notorious Cases from Fraud to Serial Killing. She's also had a career as a university professor, a mystery writer, a provost. Have I missed something? I've missed something. I know I have. We'll come back to it. You wrote an article in a publication called Mystery Reader's Journal, in which you defined the South, and part of the definition included this, quote, "We are violent. If the South is removed from U.S. homicide statistics, suddenly the U.S. becomes a remarkably safe place." How do you explain that a place that also leads the country in people of faith is a violent, murderous part of the country?
Now, when you couch
Why are
it
we
that
laughing
way,
about this?
when you couch it that way, yeah. It's what Sunday morning and Saturday night are different, I guess. But this has been across time, from early days in the country until now. This is true.
Yeah.
You take the South out of the murder statistics. People from Europe would come here and visit. Come to the United States to visit. Part of it, people point to racial divides and things like that. I think a lot of us are just Celts. We fight we're Celtic.
Celts?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
We fight first and figure out why later. I mean, just and some people say it's the Southern honor thing. There's all kinds of, explanations for this. But we are raised with this sort of sense of kind of bow up and defend yourself and figure out why later. And that seems to be, again, why we have these really stupid, gun-violent crimes, black and white.
You kicked us off in this conversation by talking about the Charlotte News tongue-in-cheek editorial in 1940 bemoaning the fact that we didn't make the list of the murder capital of America when we, in fact, were the murder capital of America. But about 20 years later, in the 1960s, we would be dubbed Little Chicago.
Yes.
Because of the murders that we experienced here. So where do we stand? Does Charlotte have a significant place in Southern crime history and statistics?
We really don't now. Past that point now, I guess it's 1997, the crack epidemic. We had pretty high. It was earlier than that. I get my days wrong. We were top and tall cotton. That was our high water mark for the homicide rate here. And people say, well, there's other crimes too. That's true, but homicide...
It was higher than when we were called Little Chicago.
But per capita, yes, it was high. And so and Pam Kelly wrote so beautifully about that in her book Money Rock, that was that period of time where you have cocaine, which had been the rich man's drug, hitting the street all of a sudden as crack. And it just changed everything. So we still see some of those same influences in the drug culture and the edges of things, which is why Charlotte feels remarkably safe to most of us, as it should.
What was going on here in 1960 that we were dubbed Little Chicago? Who dubbed us that? The newspaper or somebody
Yes.
else? Okay, why would we call that? The Observer?
We pat ourselves on the back. Yeah. We had a lot of motorcycle gang activity then.
See, I don't think people remember that.
Charlotte was one of just this tiny little number of cities in the country where you had the headquarters, local headquarters, regional headquarters for both Hells Angels and the Outlaws. And we also had our own homegrown gangs like the Tar Heel Stompers and the Southern Gentlemen and lists of others. And they were running the drugs and prostitution in Charlotte at the time, into the 70s.
So it wasn't really about motorcycles.
No, apparently not. Apparently not. And this was huge. I mean, this was a huge nexus for that activity.
In your book, you chose not to dwell on PTL which was the big story in the 1980s,
Yes.
which made international headlines, actually, because it was an international television show that was involved in this, the PTL Club with Jim and Tammy Baker. You chose not to dwell on that. You chose not to dwell on Loomis Fargo, the heist, which I think at the time was the 7th largest heist in history.
I think as late as 2018, 2017, still, yeah.
And you chose not to dwell on the Ray Carruth incident.
Yeah, those are all great cases, yeah.
But if smaller crimes are part of the fabric of who we are, why aren't these bigger crimes?
They are, but other people had written about them fairly
Extensively.
recently and had done it well. So that was people know those stories and they can find those stories.
So instead, and there are some contemporary, relatively contemporary stories in
Yes.
your book, which we'll talk about. But I want to start with the Razor Girl story because that goes way back to 1926. Razor Girl, her name is Nellie Freeman. If you use, and this is my frame of reference for life, if you use Broadway musicals as a measure, the 1920s were a time for females to commit heinous crimes.
Apparently so.
You look at Chicago, you look at Parade. Well, actually, the crime wasn't committed by a female in Parade. It was committed on a female, Little Mary Fagan in
Yeah.
Atlanta.
Yes.
Both of those are about the 1920s and
Yes.
these horrible crimes. And you call this Razor Girl, about which there is no, as of yet, no musical. You call this one of your favorite cases,
It
too. It
is.
certainly was one of mine as I read the book. Why? Why you?
I've got to give a shout out to Sheila Baumgartner at the research room at the library here. She dug this out for a journalist some time back, and I stumbled across it then and fell in love. I think that Razor Girl Nellie Freeman's case marks that point in time. She had this worthless, shiftless husband who was actually a bigamist, who was taking her mill worker wages and running around and drinking and carousing, and then he announced he was leaving her.
Yeah.
And she wasn't going to have that. So she was hugging him and begging him to stay and just somehow managed to almost cut his head off. And the district attorney in town said, I am not letting another woman, and McNinch, I'm not letting another woman get away with murder. There's just entirely too much of that going on. So this set the stage. And
Let's go back because you bring he was tired of women getting away with murder because at the time women did get away.
This is the South, of course.
Put women in jail. You couldn't do that.
It's a done thing.
She and her husband lived in Camp Green, or the
Yes.
Camp Green area.
Yes.
She worked at Nebel Mills.
Yes.
As you mentioned, he was unemployed. He was kind of a ne'er-do-well, philandering ne'er-do-well. He threatened to leave her. She just wanted to scare him with a little straight razor. She was 19 years old.
Yeah, she was young.
And
And
she-
tiny. She's a very tiny woman.
She decapitated him
Yes,
with that
she
straight
did.
razor. I mean, can you how much force
Yeah.
does it take to do that with a straight razor?
He'd been taking her money and running around on her. Now, come on.
Wow. But it was a time when women were not sent to jail, at a time when women were seen as emotional,
Yes.
especially in the face of an unfaithful husband.
Completely justifiable. Yes.
And despite the prosecutor, Lynch, despite his determination, how did the jury approach this? How did that color the trial, the fact that she was this
This-
little woman who did this to a
This
philandering
was
husband?
a whole circus here. They were actually selling commemorative straight razor pins on the
Yes.
courthouse steps. I wish I had one of those.
You know somebody has one.
I know they do, and I hope they know how valuable it is. People turned out for this. And, of course, the jury, all-male jury, of course, in the 1920s, acquitted her. And she asked if she could have her dress and the razor back, and she left town.
And they gave her the dress and the
Yes,
razor. Why
they
would
did.
she want that?
Well, I don't know.
Why would you give the razor back?
I cannot answer these questions. I can only lay out for you what
The
happened.
public was smitten with this woman. This is the Chicago story.
This
If you've never
is.
seen the musical, this is the story.
She's a tiny, tiny little, and she's flirty, very flirty and vivacious and engaging. So, yeah, she was perfect.
Are there still elements of that, you think, in us today?
There,
or is that
oh,
just
absolutely.
times?
And no, I think there still is. And there's a little part of me that hopes we don't lose all of it. So there's this chivalry will indeed be dead when we can't look at this with a sense of humor.
Well, she got off scot-free.
She did.
And she got the Razorback.
She got the Razorback, yeah.
She vanished from the headlines because she left town. But then she came back to town.
Fairly quickly, yeah.
Yes, with a new husband.
Yes.
Now, there's a brave
There's
man.
a brave man. But he's from Kentucky. That, maybe he didn't know the whole story. We didn't have social media then. He couldn't Google her.
It took effort to look up the archives in the newspaper, too. But they returned to live in Enderley Park, which is not too far from Camp Green, when you come right down to it. And she lived a peaceful, happy life.
Raised her kids,
Raised
yeah.
children. Never committed another crime, to the best of our knowledge.
No.
Right?
And that's true of an awful lot of murders, frankly. Once they get the job done, that's the end of it. Statistically
So would
speaking.
you say, because they talked about her, I think they said she was not guilty by reason of insanity, correct?
Yes.
And I've had people on this program say that's not a viable defense. That's
It
not.
really isn't now.
But
We're so much smarter now.
but if you have had this man in your life who is abusive and who has taken all of your money, and you're the only one working, and you're working at a miserable job and very hard at it,
Hard job.
and he's philandering and you know it, isn't that insane? I mean, aren't you momentarily just so angry that you are blind to the morality of it?
And the French have always had the crime passionnel,
Right.
which we tend to make fun of that there. But I do think that that's something that really happens to folks, men and women.
Yeah.
But you can see, especially for her, she would not have had a lot of power in her life at that. What else is she going to do? Where else is she going to go?
And interestingly, well, if he had left her, at least she would be able to keep her money.
Her $15.
Yeah, but I mean, she maintained a relationship with her late husband's family.
She did.
Explain that to me.
Yeah. Well, I think it explains itself. Yeah. Don't you think?
They knew he was a
They
ne'er-do-well?
knew him.
They knew him.
They knew him better than she did, perhaps. Yeah. That's what makes this so interesting, though. People persist in being complicated, and that's what makes them endlessly fascinating.
People seem to be fascinated by high-profile trials because they still make headlines today, and cable news covers them toe-to-toe, head-to-head, moment by moment.
When you hit Dateline, you've got it. You've done it.
Right,
Yeah.
and that's not just confined to heinous crimes. I mean, the most recent trial, I guess, that people covered, gavel to gavel, was the Paul Manafort
Yes.
trial because of its connections to the White House. Is this the same thing in operation that you spoke about when you talked about true crime fascination? Just we are just fascinated by people who are accused of something, who are going through the process.
These are the big stakes. I think that's why crime dramas and hospital dramas have always headlined on television shows. I mean, think about it. This is the one time in life where most of us would face life and death questions. And for most of us, it's at a safe remove. We're not the one on trial. Okay, we can watch it. And we're also sort of used to, probably because of television, probably because of Perry Mason, used to a certain amount of drama.
Yeah. It doesn't happen like it happens on television.
Well, see, I used to tell my clients that, and then one time someone stood up in the back I said, nobody's going to stand up and say, I did it. Someone stood up in the back of the courtroom and screamed, you sorry, lying, blank, 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 talking about the doctor on the stand at the time. And I thought, great, somebody else saw him for what he was. And I noticed the judge was not looking at him, but at us, thinking we had planted that.
So this book, True Crime Stories, is not confined to the city of Charlotte proper.
No.
It covers the region.
Yes.
Crimes throughout the region, including that of a fraudster by the name of Gaston Bullock Means.
Got to love him, too.
From Concord. Who is he?
He got to love him, too. He's had a slight role on a cable television show, Boardwalk Empire, recently.
Really?
But most people don't know him. And he got away with murder. He defrauded the woman who owned the Hope Diamond, telling her she could help rescue the Lindbergh baby. That
was his end.
That's what did him in.
Yeah.
But before that, he's peddling influence from the Justice Department in President Warren Harding's administration. He's in and out of prison. He's in and out of scams, and apparently just a big, soft, doughy, dimple-cheeked, southern, slow-talking boy
Who did well in New York.
who did really well in New York.
Because I think people in New York, when they see that, even today, when they hear somebody talk like this, they think you're a country hick, and you're probably as bright as the brightest light bulb in the chandelier.
You're right. That might have helped him out there. Yeah.
But also, they just find it charming.
Just
they
find
want to
it
hear
so
you
charming.
talk more.
And especially if you're courtly, a courtly
Yes.
gentleman.
He he was born and raised in Concord in a prominent family. There's a street up there with
Yeah.
the family name on it. Did he use that prominent upbringing to his advantage in
Well,
some way?
when he started with the Cannon Mills, he was a salesman. First, he
Yes.
was a school teacher, and then a salesman.
Yes, let's talk about that, because he had been superintendent of schools
in
in
Albemarle. Yeah.
And
You wonder if they know that.
That's right. He headed north to sell Turkish towels for Cannon Mills in Kannapolis. And he was a very successful salesman.
successful.
Was he successful because he was a good salesman, or because these are good towels?
Yeah, that's the question. And how do you go from being a school teacher trained at the University of North Carolina to being an incredibly talented con man? I mean, where does this get stirred in there?
Mm-hmm.
And I think the charm was part of it. And maybe I think he enjoyed the game of it. There's not any indication. He certainly didn't finish well. He died fairly young in prison. But he just seemed to enjoy the game.
Yeah. He didn't go wrong, as you write, until he switched careers in 1911. He went to work for the head of the Pinkerton Detective Agency.
The Burns Detective.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay.
William Burns, yeah.
Well, this is before police departments had gotten big, and before
Yes.
police departments really had dedicated detectives. They were just patrolmen for the most part. So the Pinkerton and the Burns Agency were brought in on cases.
Especially across state lines, yeah.
Okay, and he transitioned at that point to the other side of the law with deadly effect, at least for Maud King. Who was
Yes.
Maud King? What happened?
Maud King's husband had made a lot of money in Chicago, I think in the logging business, and he had died and left her a vast fortune, but knew that she probably was not going to be good with money, so he had tied it up.
Was this the story in Boardwalk Empire?
Yeah,
This rings a bell.
Because it was his job. The Boardwalk Empire is around the Harding administration, so it would have been later in his career.
Okay.
But so she needs protection from these swindlers from Monte Carlo who are taking her money, and so Burns later said he didn't introduce them. William Burns of the Burns Detective Agency. Oh no, he met her in social circles, but really probably met her through the Burns Agency. Burns Detective Agency, and he was supposed to protect her. Well, he did, and, made sure that she didn't waste her money on anybody else.
Except him.
And then as things were they'd run through that, he came suddenly up with a new will from her husband that took away the trust protections and gave all the money to her. And then he brings her to Concord, bound down to his hometown, and they're going to do a little paper signing, and he talks her into going on a night hunt. Now, this is a very proper big city woman who has an aversion to guns, who somehow agrees to go on a night hunt, and then somehow ends up getting shot, supposedly by herself, in the back of the head, and she dies.
It's a cute trick.
Yes. But down here, they're not going to prosecute him.
Right. So let me stop you there, because there's more.
There's more.
There's a lot more to his story. And we'll talk about that, and we'll talk about the biker stories, too, because that's something a lot of people don't know about. And then there's this guy named Frank Littlejohn. We'll get to him, too, in Charlotte Talks on WFAE. Support for Charlotte Talks comes from WFAE members and Corkscrew Wine Shop and Bar, located at The View in Uptown Charlotte, Brookdale Village in Lake Norman, and Kingsley Village Town Center in Fort Mill. With wine and beer from all over the world, relax, uncork, unwind. CorkscrewWinepub.com. An estimated 7.6 million workers in this country are undocumented immigrants, making up nearly 5% of the labor force. The Trump administration has made cracking down on these workers a priority, while the people who hire them are rarely punished. Business owners, frustrated by the immigration stalemate in Washington now, are calling for solutions, and we'll hear about that coming up in 20 minutes at 10 o'clock with Joshua Johnson and his guests on 1A. And we will continue our conversation about true Charlotte crime stories. just a moment. Stay with us.
It's your world. We help you explore it.
To France now, where the culture minister says Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris is still in danger of collapsing.
It's your community. We help you understand it.
The latest plans approved this week for Duke Energy's 2 North Carolina units call for more cleaner-burning gas-fired power plants and more solar energy.
WFAE's Morning Edition is an essential way to start your day and stay connected to your world. Listen weekday mornings from 5 to 9 on 90.7 WFAE.
It's Charlotte Talks on WFAE and WFHE. I'm Mike Collins. Our guest today is Kathy Pickens, former college professor, provost, mystery writer, and now she's written about crime, true crime, Charlotte's true crime stories. That's the name of the book, Notorious Cases from Fraud to Serial Killing. And when we last left you, we were talking about Gaston Bullock Means from Concord, who in 1911, somewhere in there, became a detective for the Burns Detective Agency and then made the acquaintance of Maud King, who he was supposed to protect from being defrauded of her money, and instead he took the opportunity to defraud her of her money and allegedly take her life because he brought her to Concord from, where was she from?
In New York. They were living in New York.
A woman who had an aversion to guns, and talked her into going on a night hunt, at which time she allegedly accidentally shot herself in the back of the head, a cute trick. They put him on trial for this. Mm-hmm. He hired every lawyer in Concord to represent him. They got him off?
They did.
Why? How?
Well, if you think about it, this is happening not that long after the Civil War. And all the attorneys really seemed to say was, look at this. These are people from Chicago and New York City stirring this up and making this seem like something it's not. And so we come back with an acquittal. I mean, it's very much regionalism, very strong. And of course, his family was known in town. They had, he had lots of family around Concord. So off he goes to yet more adventures.
So he's tried and found not guilty, and then goes to work for the FBI.
Yes.
Did he, during Prohibition?
Background checks must not have been what they are now, huh?
During Prohibition, and he profited, right?
Oh, greatly,
from this.
yeah. From one little shenanigan after another, it would be hard to trace them all.
Okay.
Yeah.
He ultimately would spend time in the Atlanta Penitentiary and later become involved in the publication of a book that alleged President Harding was poisoned by his wife.
Yes. Yeah.
But that's not what ultimately led to his downfall. He was brought up on federal charges, as you mentioned, for grand larceny, for a scheme to con money from those searching for the Lindbergh baby in 1932. This guy was involved in everything.
I mean, he's just, he was the Forrest Gump of crime. I mean, just think about it. He just showed up everywhere.
Amazing. So for people who want to look him up, and you could read about him in this book, Gaston Bullock Means.
Yes.
All right, fast forward to the 1970s. Crime did not stop in the 1920s. The worst mass killing in Charlotte history. 5 people slaughtered in an outlaw motorcycle gang clubhouse on Independence Day in 1979 on Allen Road South. I don't even know where that is. As you point out, the article in the paper went relatively unnoticed, and it would be years later that the case was ultimately closed. Why didn't mass murder of that sort attract the kind of attention it would today?
The murder itself did. The article that didn't attract attention was an arrest of a couple of motorcycle gang guys.
Okay.
They were brought back to town on a motorcycle theft charge, and people weren't really paying any attention to a tiny little, 1 column inch, 2 column inch thing. But that, if you put the pieces together all these years later, those were the killers. The police had them, couldn't prove it. They weren't gang members; they were kind of hangers-on.
Took 36 years.
Yeah, and finally, after the 2 guys were dead, they put, they could come. Put the pieces, got the calls that you wait for. But let's face it, these are people that people would have been afraid to say, well, he did it. So it took a while, and it took their deaths.
These motorcycle gangs, as you mentioned, were tied up in prostitution and drugs, and there were several of them in the area. And why did they ultimately, assuming that they did, die out?
The internet.
Because you
can
because it was also pornography.
Yeah,
they were involved in pornography.
The dirty bookstores and the hookups with prostitutes. You get that online now.
Online, yeah.
You can order your drugs online, I guess. So what we're left with now is a more diverse, diffused drug business.
So the world is so much better.
But maybe less colorful. I don't know.
Not all crime stories in your book, as I said, are from a long time ago. There are the murders of Kim Medlin that you write about, and the murder of Kim Thomas. They figure prominently, and they were in the 90s. Kim Thomas, her story held the public's attention for a very long time. Remind people who may be newcomers, who was Kim Thomas?
Kim Thomas came here with her doctor husband. They lived just off Wendover Road, just a few blocks from my house now.
In Cotswold.
In Cotswold. An activist with the National Organization for Women, and was found murdered in her house.
Was she an activist, or was she just a member of the National Organization?
She was one of the ones who was really coordinating things. She was a bit of a, she'd come from New York City to Charlotte. What do you think? Okay.
And is that why you say that her case was one ready-made to capture headlines?
I think so.
Suburban housewife.
A woman is bound and with handcuffs and dead in her dining room, and her baby's in the crib crying. Her adopted son, who she very much wanted and very much loved, and her doctor husband comes home and finds her. And then you have sex, and then he's having an affair, and then you have all this stuff. So people in town were absolutely certain that he had done it. They just made up their minds because that's how that story was supposed to go.
Yeah.
Until he has the lawyer who has since become famous in the Michael Peterson case and the Staircase
David Rudolph
series on cable television. He comes to town and does the unusual act of bringing a civil lawsuit against the guy that, frankly, looking at the evidence, probably did it.
Let's back up, because this trial went on not the trial, but the investigation and the story seemed to drag on for
It went on for a long time, and it was unsolved. You kept seeing her picture in the paper on anniversary articles.
It went on for a long time without an arrest. So from a person writing about crime, does that make cases like this that drag on more intriguing?
Because we have more time to make up the ending as we think it should be, and it remains this horrible unsolved puzzle. And again, we like to solve puzzles.
Yeah, it took 4 years for Kim Thomas's husband, Dr. Ed Friedland, to be formally charged with his wife's murder. Forensic evidence was deemed insufficient to meet the burden of proof in the criminal trial that he killed her. That they couldn't prove that, so the charges were dropped.
Yes.
They dropped the charges rather than go to trial, because if they found more evidence, if they'd gone to trial and he was acquitted, they couldn't retry him. So they thought, we'll leave the door open to the possibility. So that left the specter of guilt hanging over this man for years.
Yes.
Then there was the civil case that the doctor brought against, to prove his innocence. How unusual, we'll talk about who he brought it against in a second, but how unusual is it for the possible defendant in a criminal trial to then bring a civil case against somebody else?
It's almost unheard of, because how many possible criminal defendants have the money to hire a really good trial lawyer to bring the case for them? He would have to come up with the money.
So he brought a wrongful death suit against Marion Anthony Gales, who had done yard work for the couple. And this area is near the Billingsley Road area.
Yes.
And I think Mr. Gales lived in that part of town. He'd never been charged, Mr. Gales, in a criminal trial, although he had a
record, but not murder.
Yeah. The jury in the civil trial believed that he did it, and he ordered Gale to pay Dr. Friedland $8.6 million. Mr. Gales is indigent. Why would they do that?
Well, one of the jurors said, well, we knew we weren't really giving away anybody's money, but we wanted to make the statement because we did believe that the evidence was.
And he had a long criminal record and would later, if I'm not mistaken, be convicted of murder in another case. Yes. So is the upshot here that we still don't know who killed Kim Thomas?
As officially, no, we do not.
Officially, no. What does that mean?
There's been no criminal prosecution, and probably won't be, because can you bring a case and say, oh, well, we thought it was this one guy, but now we think it's this guy? The district attorney's not really going to bet a lot of time and money.
Will this be another one of the situations like the biker case, where we will know after all the principals are dead?
Maybe. There has to be somebody that
Comes forward.
That comes forward.
There's no DNA evidence?
No.
Why not? How can that be?
Exactly, exactly. Was the crime scene processed properly? This was a while back, and there was a question even at the time about whether things had been preserved properly. And but Gales was known for rather sloppy crime scenes, so that's a question. They were going to test the handcuffs with touch DNA, and apparently nothing came of that because we haven't heard about that, and that was a few years ago.
Okay.
So that's what we have so far.
Okay. And Dr. Friedland has moved on
Yes.
to other parts.
Yes, married, raising his children, including the adopted son. Yeah.
All right. Let's talk about one of your favorite people, and that is Frank Littlejohn. He's one of the city's crime fighters.
Yes.
He's not a criminal.
No.
But relatively unknown today, but he was named by FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover as America's finest detective. Coming from J. Edgar Hoover, I don't know what that means. I got to tell you, J. Edgar Hoover has some problems. But that came from his work on what some have called Charlotte's Crime of the Century.
Yes.
We got
to have one of those every other year. Yeah.
That's right. Crime of the century. This is the robbery of a Federal Reserve money shipment. Does this beat out the Loomis Fargo heist?
I don't think so. But for sheer daring, it might, because this was an armed robbery. Yeah.
So tell us more. What happened here with this Federal Reserve money shipment?
Well, this is when gangsters were going to lose the ability to make a lot of money because prohibition was coming to an end. But that didn't mean their legal bills were over. So a Chicago gangster sent some of his guys down here to lift the shipment from the Federal Reserve. Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing about Littlejohn was he had feelers out in the community all over the place, blacks and whites. He just kept a good finger on the pulse of the town.
He would later become the chief of police here.
He would, and he knew something was going to happen. Something was coming down months before it happened. And it was his very meticulous attention to detail of laundry receipt discarded, checking the roads they would have taken out of town to see where the car might have been discarded.
Yeah, he heard something. He got wind of something. Something was going to happen. He didn't know what it was, but something was going to happen. And it was going to happen, what? Downtown, uptown, what do you want to call it? So he immediately thought, well, if you do something, you got to get out of town.
Exactly.
So I will make sure that all the roads out of town are patrolled heavily. Yeah. And that's what he did?
And he found the abandoned car. He didn't stop them at the city gate, so to speak, but he did track them to Chicago, led to their capture and later conviction. Yeah.
You describe him as outspoken, unorthodox in his tactics, and not always liked by his superiors. Wait a minute, you're talking about me. But effective at solving crimes. He found the getaway car, at the bottom of an embankment. Mm-hmm. Why did they wreck the car?
Yeah, they were trying to hide it.
They were just trying to hide it.
Changed cars and headed on.
And so these guys were out of Chicago. How did he ultimately find them?
Yes, a crumpled up laundry ticket led back to Chicago.
Why isn't this a movie?
I know, isn't it fascinating? Well, his whole life was like this. He was a bit brusque, and yet Daddy Grace at the United House of Prayer for All People, Chief Littlejohn comes in and he calls him down front and he says, y'all, he's our friend. Y'all help him out if he needs it. I mean, he had informants all over the place. He solved all kinds of cases and apparently kept some things from happening. But Charlotte was also had some corruption, apparently, in city government at the time, and he just called people out.
Really? What years was this?
He was, now you're going to put me on the spot, 1950s, I guess.
Okay.
40s, 50s. He came to town, though, from South Carolina as a shoe salesman. So you just never know where life might lead.
Shoe salesman, towel salesman. Yeah. I'm in the wrong line of work.
Apparently so.
There are lots more things that we have not talked about that are in this book, and a lot more individuals and crimes. But you close the book with the story of Henry Louis Wallace, who was a serial killer who began his crimes, I think, in the 90s, and committed them in such a way that he really didn't seem to have an MO. And police and the public at large, when these crimes were put in the paper and on television, didn't connect them to one person. They didn't appear to be serial killings. Mm-hmm. They were just women dying
Black women.
Black
yeah.
women being murdered all over town over the course of time, which made it very difficult for them to catch the guy. What led to them tying this together and realizing that they had a serial killer on their hands?
He got sloppy. His drug habit got worse, and he got more and more frantic about it, apparently. But it caused a lot of. When I say that stories should sort of mark and define us, this is one that really brought to the fore race relations within the department, the police department at the time, and with the community, and how the police department dealt with victims' families and those sorts of things. But looking back at it, you can see what a horrendous job it was for the police, because he was so scattered and every crime scene was different. And until he told them what he had done, they didn't even know all of
Yeah,
them.
but he told some, when they finally got him, he talked about women that he'd killed that they had no idea.
But you can see how upset the families would be, thinking you're just not doing your job.
How many young women?
Now, at 11, frankly,
11?
yeah.
That's what we know about.
Yeah.
Could have been. And what happened to him? Where is
He's
he?
in prison. He confessed.
He didn't get the death penalty?
He confessed. Well, he confessed, and he gave very detailed outlines of every crime.
What do you want people to take from Charlotte true crime stories? Notorious cases from fraud to serial killing. What do you want people to take from it?
Well, some of it is told, as I hope is evident, with a sense of humor, that we need to not take ourselves quite so seriously. But we also need to understand these stories. They shouldn't be lost. These are people's lives. These are people who lived here, who have helped shape this city. And their stories are important. And in some ways, they reflect and perhaps prepare us for and give us our dress rehearsal for things we might face.
And it's, as you might imagine, from a mystery writer, they're written like that in this book to a certain degree, but they're fun to read and they're quick to read as well. That's
thank you.
Kathy Pickens' new book, Charlotte True Crime Stories. Thank you for the hour.
Thank you.